All right, I think it's time to start. We have 21 participants, and I believe that some other participants will join us very soon. Okay, so hi everyone. Welcome to another serious security seminar today. So today's speaker is Levi Lloyd. Levi, thank you so much for joining us. It's really nice to see you, and I'm looking forward to be honest, to your presentation today. So I would like to briefly introduce Levi. So Levi Lloyd is a cybersecurity researcher at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, where he works in the Cyber and Infrastructure Resilience Program. His interests include software assurance, binary analysis, reverse engineering, malware analysis, and network traffic analysis, and defense. He has been involved in the creation of several frameworks aimed at doing cybersecurity analysis at scale. So today his talk will be on securing the software supply chain.
All right. Well, thank you. I appreciate that introduction. It's great to be here with you all today. When I first got the invitation to give this seminar, maybe 6 months ago or so, I was envisioning myself coming to Purdue and being there with you in person, which, as we know, the pandemic has made it so that we can't do that as much anymore. But I was looking at the weather report today for Lafayette, and I'm actually kind of glad I'm still here in sunny California. I'll let you guys endure the cold weather, but still very happy to be here, and hopefully someday I'll get a chance to visit Purdue campus. So as was said, I'm going to talk to you today about securing the software supply chain, and I'll talk about some of the software assurance solutions that we've been developing here at Lawrence Livermore. So to start with, I just want to give a little bit of background and information about my organization. So Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory is one of 17 Department of Energy national laboratories throughout the country. And it's located kind of on the outskirts of the San Francisco Bay Area in California. It was established in the 50s, at the beginning of the Cold War, and was instrumental in developing capabilities that helped us emerge from the Cold War. You can see on this slide here some other details, which I'll just let you read. But I want to bring up our mission because I think it's really important and helps to kind of set the stage for what I'll be talking about today. And the mission of the laboratory is to strengthen our national security through world-class science, technology, and engineering. And if you think about, where the world was in the 50s, it was a very different place. It was during the Cold War, and there was a need to develop this nuclear deterrence and essentially, protect our nation through those means. But over time, things have evolved, and there are, lots of different threats now to our national security. And because of that, Lawrence Livermore has kind of emerged and developed into a multi-program laboratory, and we're a multidisciplinary, multi-program laboratory. And so over here on the side, you can see, some of the disciplines that, for the scientists and engineers that come to the lab. We're known for our computing. So high performance computing is a big part of what we do at Lawrence Livermore. In fact, the photo you can see behind me in the virtual background here is one of our supercomputers, CERIAS, that is currently the third fastest supercomputer in the world at 125 teraflops. So pretty big scale, high performance computing, and something that we're all proud of here. As was mentioned, I work in the area of cybersecurity, and so my particular area is focused, has a dual nature. So we're interested in making sure that our energy sources are, renewable and not influenced by foreign powers. And then also we want to make sure that the infrastructure that provides our energy is free from vulnerabilities and is resilient to cyber attack. So that is the Cyber and Infrastructure Resilience program that I work with. So let's talk about software. Software is all around us. We all use it all the time. And quite often we don't even think about the software that we're using. It tends to fade into the background unless you are a computer scientist or somebody that develops code. But we all use it, and it's really kind of a key part of our modern lives. And so if you think about some of these things that we interact with on a daily basis, sometimes we don't realize how much code is actually running in these. So let's play a little game here, and if this was in person, I would do it interactive, but we'll just pretend like you're answering. So how many lines of code do you think are running on a Boeing 747? So there's actually 6.5 million lines of code there. And we all have smartphones. We love them. We use them all the time. So I think these numbers may be a little dated, but the Android operating system is running about 15 million lines of code. Another example, healthcare.gov. You may remember this came out several years ago, and it's kind of this portal for allowing Americans to find healthcare coverage. And it was a big deal when it came out because there were lots of problems. So it's actually 500 million lines of code to run that thing. And when they had all those problems on the initial release, they had to patch it, and it required another 100 million lines of code to do that. So the car down here, this Audi, I'm not sure which model, but pretty fancy car. It's running 100 million different lines of code in that automobile. And then down in the center, we have the Mars Curiosity rover, which only takes 5 million lines of code. So it just tells you it's easier to drive on Mars than it is to drive on Earth. Probably because they don't have any crazy drivers on Mars yet. And finally, a nuclear power plant. How many lines of code do you think would be in a nuclear power plant? Well, I actually don't know, but if you do know, please let me know, because I would love to add that here. But it's a lot. You know, I'm sure it's millions of lines of code running in the different control systems that work in our nuclear power plants. So this brings to mind a few questions. And if you think about, you know, kind of my background and where I'm working, you might see why I would have these questions. So let's think about it. Which components are used in these devices or these things that we're interacting with? And where do these software components come from? How was it built? And is it safe to use? Are there any vulnerabilities in the software? And when you're thinking of national security, this next question is particularly relevant. Did my adversaries play a part in the development or the packaging of this software? And finally, were coding best practices used in its development? So, you know, these are all interesting questions and super relevant to our daily modern lives. But when you think about our nation's critical infrastructure, the things that are providing our energy and the things that we rely on for our safety and our health and things like that, these questions become even more important. Which is why statements like these are kind of concerning. So this is some testimony from Dan Coates, a former director of national intelligence, that he gave in testimony to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. And he basically said that there are foreign countries that are actively investigating and trying out technologies to be able to disrupt our critical infrastructure. And you know, this has been going on for years, and it's not a secret anymore. It's something that we talk openly about. And you can look up newspaper articles as well that talk about what the United States is doing in this regard to other countries. And so, you know, these type of things have moved to the forefront of the dialogue, the national dialogue. And frankly, it's kind of concerning. So how do we secure our critical infrastructure? Well, obviously the federal government has been thinking about that, and this is a chart that came from a report that was developed by the Cybersecurity and Information Security Agency, part of DHS, that talks about supply chain risks, and it kind of breaks up the supply chain into these different phases. And you know, I apologize for the small font, you probably can't read it all, but just know that at each stage of the supply chain, there are opportunities for malicious actors to insert functionality that you may not want there. And there's also opportunities for vulnerabilities to creep in, maybe unwittingly. And so these are things that we need to think about as we think about the software that's running in our critical infrastructure. So let me give a few examples of why this is a concern, or how this has been manifested recently. So the first is the Ripple 20 set of vulnerabilities that were disclosed last September. Last June. They were initially discovered in September 2019. So these are a set of vulnerabilities that were disclosed for a bit of software called the TREC TCP/IP stack. And this is a software stack that runs in a lot of embedded control systems. So industrial control systems and medical devices and things like that. And what's interesting about TREC is they don't do a lot of direct sales to to the end customers. So they develop this TCP/IP stack, and then other vendors incorporate that into their products. And the researchers that discovered these vulnerabilities, it's from JSOF in Israel, found that there's lots of different things that they could do to these devices that are running this TCP/IP stack. They demonstrated some remote code execution vulnerabilities, and were able to basically take full control of these devices. And so if you are an asset owner, somebody that owns one of these industrial control systems or devices and use that for deploying your system, or it's deployed in your system, then you would probably want to know if these vulnerabilities were present and what to do about them. If we look at the affected vendors, this is from the website where the disclosure was made. There's a whole bunch of systems that are listed here. These ones are confirmed. These ones are still investigating. I should mention that the researchers did follow pretty strict and responsible disclosure practices. They worked with the vendor for, I think, more than a standard 120 days before they disclosed it publicly. But anyway, when I look at these lists, what I see are some of them, they're all obviously big names and probably important things, but based on my background and what I've been looking at over the last couple of years, these ones kind of jump out at me because these are vendors that sell equipment that go into the power grid and other critical infrastructure systems. All right, so that's what can happen if vulnerabilities make it through all the Q&A process at these vendors and end up in our devices that we rely on. Now, there's another type of concern, and that is supply chain compromise, where somebody, an attacker, is able to insert their malicious code into the supply chain, into the products that are being produced. And the example I wanted to share with that is a recent one, the Solarwinds supply chain compromise. So this has been in the news quite a bit lately. It was first discovered back in December by FireEye, and they were investigating some strange behavior on their network and started to kind of unravel this whole thing. And from there, it has just spiderwebbed out, and there's all sorts of companies that are being affected. And it's not just SolarWinds. That was just one kind of vector into all these companies. But it's really interesting to read about and see how they were able to make use of this software that many companies rely on. One of the things that makes this so interesting is the target that they chose. So the SolarWinds Orion network management system provides enterprise IT monitoring. So they actually sell a product that is supposed to help you with your cybersecurity. And depending on the configuration of this device, it generally has pretty broad access to your infrastructure, to your IT infrastructure. And it also has a very high level of access, so often admin type privileges. And so it's a juicy target if you can compromise those systems, because you kind of get the keys to the kingdom through those devices. Now the malware got to these organizations over a few months period through legitimate software distribution channels. So the Orion update server, automatically pushes out updates, and the customers receive those updates and install them. And so, the very thing that security experts will tell you need to patch for vulnerabilities is actually kind of what these attackers leveraged to get in through the back door to these companies. And if you look at it, if you read the reports, all of those updates were signed by Solarwinds, so they looked legitimate, and no real reason not to trust them. Once installed, the Trojan software actually connects out to HTTP servers and does command and control, and then eventually receives. If the attackers want to proceed with the attack, it'll receive additional stages of the malware. All right, so who was affected in this one? Well, it's all the big names, and you can look at this list. They took down this list from their website after the fact because they decided maybe it wasn't a good idea to point out who all was running their software. But it's all the big companies, a lot of government organizations, all 5 branches of the military. So these are big targets. But what I wanted to point out is that if anybody is going to have the budget and the resources and the time and the talent to be able to do software supply chain assurance, it would be these guys. And yet, for many months, this went unnoticed, and the attackers were able to walk through their systems pretty easily. All right. Now, the software assurance field is not new. It's been around for quite a while, and there are lots of tools out there to help you analyze and understand your software. So we took a chance to survey the marketplace for these tools, and this is kind of what we found. So if you look at that, those 6 stages of the software supply chain, the tool space, we looked at over 200 tools, and it breaks down kind of by these numbers. Some tools fit into multiple categories, that's why it doesn't add up. But you can see here that the vast majority of these tools are focused in this phase here for the development and production of software. So developers, when they build their code, when they're developing, they have these tools and they look for bugs in their code, and a lot of that can be automated. The second highest is in the acquisition and deployment. So if you are a customer and you are purchasing software and you want to do some due diligence and see if it's got any malicious functionality or vulnerabilities perhaps, then there are tools that you can use to do that. And so those are kind of the big categories. We didn't look a lot at this disposal category. There are tools for that, but it wasn't really relevant to what we were doing in this survey. So what I want to point out here is that there's really kind of 2 divisions of these tools. There's stuff that's meant to be used kind of at the beginning of the supply chain during development, and then there's stuff to be used kind of on the receiving end, so when you receive software. But there's not a lot that kind of crosses between those. There's not a lot that correlates the 2 different areas. And so we found that to be a gap in this marketplace. And interestingly enough, the Solarwinds compromise kind of targeted that gap, right? Because they targeted the build server running at Solarwinds and were able to insert their malicious code after the development took place. So no matter what you did to the source code to look for those bugs, you wouldn't have seen it because it was inserted after the fact. And then use legitimate distribution channels to get to the customers where it was deployed. So what we can take from that is that there is a gap, and we need better tools in that space. There's a comment or a question saying, doesn't CI, CD, so continuous integration, continuous deployment, bridge that gap? And yes, it does. It can, but if you're not looking at the code going in and the code coming out and comparing those 2, you may not be able to catch something that was inserted there. All right. So let me paint the picture of our strategy here at Lawrence Livermore for doing software assurance. And this is the long-term vision. It's a journey we're on. It's not something that we've fully solved by any means. But we've been doing software assurance for quite a while, and just based on our mission, you can understand why. We have very critical functions that need to be examined, and we need to assure that those things are done securely. And so, if you take a really good like reverse engineer or somebody that understands program analysis and what makes software work, they can pretty much tell you if your software is secure. But it takes a lot of time and a lot of man hours to do that. And unfortunately, the world that we live in, there's just not enough of those type of people and that skill set to go around. So we can't rely on manual approaches to doing this type of analysis. And so we've got to have some sort of automation. So we've developed a set of tools that help with that process. And there's, it's kind of an iterative process where somebody that looks at the code and is able to understand or is able to do that analysis, that reverse engineering, and understand certain things within the code. And then we build a tool that helps to automate that. And we try to continually improve those. Over time, we hope to do that in a more automated fashion. And so one of the areas that I'll talk about here in a minute is just enumerating the components that make up your software. So we'd like to be able to do that fully automated and not require a person to do that for us. Over time, we hope that we can more fully automate the various types of analyses that we do, so discovering vulnerabilities and looking at software throughout the supply chain. And we've made some progress in that regard as well. With the eventual goal being that, maybe someday we can have devices that are able to receive their updates, and before they install them, they have a way to automatically analyze and verify that software is trustworthy and secure before deploying. So we have projects kind of running in all these different areas. Obviously, the stuff more to the right is more long-term and kind of still at the basic research stage, but we are working in this space. So one of the tools that we've spent a lot of time on at Lawrence Livermore is the ROSE framework. And maybe you've heard of it, maybe not, but ROSE is it's a compiler framework that was initially developed with kind of a single purpose in mind, and that was, I mentioned our high performance computing or supercomputing capability at the lab. And so every few years, DOE invests a lot of money in upgrading or purchasing a new supercomputer, and the code that is developed for those supercomputers needs to be ported so that it can run on the new architecture, because backwards compatibility isn't always the first consideration. In fact, I think it's seldom the first consideration for those machines. And so ROSE was developed as a way to do source-to-source transformations so that you could automate that process. So you didn't have to have somebody go through and port the code. It could just automatically take one code base and port it to the new system. Well, over the years, the framework that they developed for doing that, the researchers realized was also good for doing other types of analysis. So if you can abstract the source code to this intermediate representation, such as an abstract syntax tree, then you can run all sorts of static and dynamic analyses and produce results from that. And then over time, they realized, well, compiled software binaries aren't really that much different. I mean, they're harder for humans to understand, but they can also be represented in this abstract syntax tree, and the same types of analyses can be done on binaries. So this is ROSE. It's been around for a while. Feel free to check it out. There's an open source version that you can download here at rosecompiler.org. So this is one of the tools that we've developed for doing this. And ROSE is really powerful. You can do pretty much anything in the space of binary analysis, but it's pretty complex and complicated. It's hard for somebody to get started using it. And so we wanted to build kind kind of a wrapper around rows to make some of the common tasks a little easier to do. And so we built this tool called Longclaw. And Longclaw is an analysis framework for doing automated vulnerability discovery within software. So it's based on rows, but we've also integrated other third-party tools into the framework. And we kind of developed it from the very beginning with this idea of being highly scalable, because one of the things we've realized is, if we're ever going to make any traction on this problem of securing the supply chain, we have to look at a lot of software. You can't just look at one binary every 6 months. You need to be able to do this fast and do a lot of it. And so we built that. We built Longclaw with that in mind. And we also built it very modular. So it's easy to integrate new analysis modules into the framework. We use Docker to do that. So it's pretty nice to work with. And so I'm going to talk a little bit today about one of the use cases for this framework that we've developed. And that is developing and generating a software bill of materials. So that's abbreviated SBOM. So we've already talked about how software is pretty complex, and there's a lot of it in all applications these days. So one of the things that is kind of coming to the forefront of software assurance communities is this need to make our software a little more transparent and understand a little bit more what's going into that software. So, obviously that's not the silver bullet that will solve all problems, but if we can at least take that step, then it opens up new possibilities for doing new types of analysis. And so you can look at this diagram over here, but this kind of shows the different use cases of software bill of materials. And I listed a few of them here too, but one of the ones that we're most interested in from our perspective is vulnerability management. So understanding vulnerabilities in software. And one way to think about an SBOM is like a nutrition label for food. So, we're all pretty familiar with these because we all eat food. And, food is not something that you can just look at and know what goes into it. And so some smart person a long time ago came up with this idea of a nutrition label to break down a complex product into its components and tell you what percentage of your daily intake it includes. So could we do this for software? And here's my attempt at a software bill of materials that looks like a nutrition label. This, by the way, isn't what they really look like. I'll show you a real one here in a minute. All right. So how does one get a software bill of materials? There's kind of two ways. One is that whoever's supplying the software, whoever's making the software, could just produce that for you and distribute it with their software. And there's a grassroots effort right now, a growing community of people that think this is a really good idea, and they're working with different software vendors to incorporate these ideas into their development pipeline and their release systems so that we can just get the SBOM with the software. But that's going to take a long time for that to kind of catch on. Some people are all gung-ho to do that, but a lot of vendors need some convincing. But there are tools that can automate that for you and make that pretty easy if you do it as part of the build process for your software. But until that time, until we get kind of mass adoption, it would be nice to be able to have an SBOM for software where it's not provided by the vendor. And that's what we call an archaeological SBOM. So you get the binary software package or whatever, and you do some analysis and produce your own SBOM for it. So that's the use case that we've been working on. All right, so just a reminder on the software build process. I'm sure you guys are all pretty familiar with this, but basically you start with source code. There's all these kind of transformation steps that eventually get you to a binary executable or a library or packaged software. And at each one of these steps, these are lossy steps, so you lose some of that information that was in the original source code. But the end result is you have software that will run on your target system, and hopefully it works well. So I want to point out here, there's this option to include libraries. And hardly anybody these days just sits down at their machine, opens up a text editor, and starts cranking out code all from scratch. Modern software development, agile software development, leverages work that's already been done by others, because why reinvent the wheel? If somebody's made a nice library available, you can just include that. And so there's lots of open source libraries. There's also commercial libraries that are available for purchase that make some of those standard functions widely available. And so if you're developing something specific to your use case, but you have components or libraries that have been developed by others, you can include those right in through the build process. And so we've developed this model for software, and it really kind of breaks down into these 4 areas. So there's products. This is kind of your general idea of functionality that you have in your software. There's packages that are specific bundles of software that one instance of that product. And within that package, it contains multiple components. So these are like the individual files that make up your software package. And then each of those files, in particular the binaries or libraries, contains one or more functions. And so if we want to do that archaeological generation of an SBOM, we kind of have to go backwards, right? So we start with a software package that's a representation of a product, and we do some work to unpackage it. Usually this is pretty straightforward because a lot of the packaging tools have an unpackaged kind of equivalent. And then, based on the binary file, we can disassemble that. So there's tools that make that pretty easy to do. Probably a lot of you are familiar with IdaPro or Ghidra. Rose also has a disassembler that can do that, and that's what we use. But it produces this assembly code. And you can actually take this a step further. You could run it through a decompiler and attempt to get source code out. But a lot of times that doesn't work super well because, as I mentioned, it's this lossy process. So a lot of reverse engineers, people that are analyzing software at this level, kind of spend their time in here looking at the disassembly. All right. So if we're able to get those, if we're able to get to the point where we've disassembled the file, then we have tools that can kind of look at those functions. And so, as I mentioned in our software data model before, we have products, packages, components, and functions. And another way to think about these is kind of this multi-partite graph. So products have packages, maybe different versions of that product are produced in these different packages. And then within a package, you have various components, and the component has various functions. So this is nice if you can get this understanding of software. The problem is there's some ambiguity in this graph because at least at the bottom 2 levels, there might be overlap, right? There might be collisions where a single function exists in multiple components. And there's various reasons for this. So I probably won't get into all of those right now, but one reason that this happens is because you've got multiple versions of a library, let's say. And if code doesn't change between versions for a particular function, then it's going to stay the same. And so you'll have that same function in multiple versions. Another reason it might happen is if there's kind of this like almost inheritance or dependency within your component. So if component A relies on component B and the functionality or the function is coming from that library at the top, then that might show up in multiple places. So these are some of the problems you have to deal with when you're looking at software kind of from this bottom up approach. And this is what we've been working on in our tool. All right, so let's kind of fast forward a little bit here, since I know we're getting low on time. But our tool Longclaw is functional, and we can generate a software bill of materials. So over here on the right, I promised I would show you what an SBOM looks like, but this is one that we generated for wget, and this is in SPDX format, one of the popular formats for doing SBOMs. Our tool has a series of like analytics, so these kind of heuristic algorithms that kind of deconflict these ambiguities in the graph and try to make a good approximation of which specific version or specific component is included in that software. It's not perfect. It doesn't always work. Quite often we aren't able to distinguish between two versions, so we have to just leave that out for now. So we're working on better methods and better tools that can help to disambiguate those relationships. Another thing that we're looking at currently is there's this wealth of information for open source packages from many of the popular package managers. So if you're familiar with Debian distributions, they have the apt package manager, and they make very clear, how all those relationships are structured in this system. So we think that we can leverage that information to help enrich our database and map out some of those dependencies. So that's one of the things we're working on currently. All right, oh, I see a question popped up. Are there methods or metrics for characterizing any uncertainty in the component estimation matching? And like, for example, which version? We don't currently have that, but it's certainly something we've talked about. Like, it would be really nice to be able to say, how confident are we that this component is the one that's showing up in this software? So I agree that that would be beneficial, and we will definitely continue to work on that. Okay, so let's say we have an SBOM. Well, now what? An SBOM in and of itself, like I said, isn't a silver bullet. It's not going to solve all our problems. It may have helped a little bit with the Solarwinds compromise, depending on how the SBOM was produced. But if the bad guys have access to the build system, then they could probably just as easily, affect the SBOM that you're getting from the company. So it's debatable whether or not that would help there. But some of the other problems definitely could be helped by this. One of the things we're looking at is, how can we identify known vulnerabilities that have been disclosed, like those trick vulnerabilities, in software that we're running in our environment. So we'd like to be able to just, submit those software binaries or firmware and determine if any known vulnerabilities exist for them. So an SBOM can help with that. But one of the things that we've realized is that while it might help, kind of point a finger at a component that could have a vulnerability, with just that very high level view of the software components, you can't really pinpoint whether or not that vulnerability is present and affects that software. And so to do that, we need to go kind of to a more granular view. And the example here on the right is just showing how we do that. So we can actually look at those functions within the component and determine if they're present in our binary. There's a lot of other work that we're doing. I didn't have time to talk about it all today, but certainly, we need tools and capabilities to be able to discover unknown vulnerabilities, because that's kind of the whole point. If you know about them, they're easy to find. If you don't, then those are the ones that can really bite you. So we're working on tools that can do that. We're also looking at ways to kind of track the evolution of software. So if we're ingesting libraries into our database, how do they change between versions, and are they fixing vulnerabilities? Is the software getting better over time? Binary attestation is a really interesting area to look at. It's basically can you describe your software that you've built, in your source code, and certify that that functionality makes it through to the binary and that no additional functionality is included. So we're working on some tools for that. Concolic testing is another approach to look at, how inputs affect kind of the code flow through your program, and we want to basically be able to show which inputs cause certain behaviors. And then the last one is something that some of my colleagues are working on, which is, even if you know that this, a particular software binary has vulnerabilities in it, well, that's not the end of the story, right? Like, how does that affect the bigger picture? What is the actual impact of that? Because maybe it's running in such a way that that vulnerability doesn't really matter. It's mitigated by, the network settings or something. And so how do we take what we know about a particular piece of software and then apply that to this bigger systems problem and figure out that impact? Oh, I see another question has popped up. Has SBOM been integrated into your SecCM controls? If so, where did you integrate SBOM in the CM program? So I don't think that has happened yet for us. So I don't work directly for the organization that's responsible for the NIST 853 controls in our organization. So the tools we're developing certainly could be applied there, but they haven't yet. So future work, I guess, future progress for us. All right, so I just want to wrap up and leave a little bit of time for questions. In conclusion, software is very complex and it's full of risks to organizations that are using it. In some cases, even our security best practices make this a more challenging problem, because we have this constant update process and lots of new software coming in that really should be evaluated before it's deployed. There are many tools available, but there's still gaps that exist in kind of this bigger picture, broader ecosystem. And we think that automation is key to solving these problems because of the scale of the problem. So I talked about SBOMs and how they might help to identify vulnerabilities in our supply chain, but definitely further work is needed to build new tools and address some of those gaps and find unknown vulnerabilities and what their impact is on our devices. So with that, I will open it up to questions. And thank you all for sitting through that and listening to me.
All right, thank you so much. It was an interesting talk. Okay, I think we have one question. So Krasimir, you say you have a comment, I guess, not question. Let me see very quick here. Okay. So I have a quick question actually. So in your slides, I didn't see any fuzzing. So in recent years, as you might see, like in research community, there are diverse fuzzing frameworks. Mm-hmm. So like, do they help you find the vulnerabilities, or did you integrate any fuzzing tool into your like the life cycle of your software analysis?
Yeah, so we haven't done that yet. That survey that I talked about, some of those 200 tools, there were a number of fuzzers that we looked at, and it's definitely a useful tool for discovering vulnerabilities, like you said. So yeah, absolutely, you should do that. Our tools have mostly been focused kind of on static analysis, so not actually executing the code, whereas fuzzers generally want to execute the code to be able to find those vulnerabilities.
Yes, may make sense, right? So
yeah. Yeah, this idea of concolic testing that I talked about also is pretty powerful in that regard as well, because one of the challenges in fuzzing is getting inputs that will kind of exercise the functionality in your code.
Yes.
And there's lots of smart ways of doing that. People have been working on that for quite a while. but I think concolic testing is one way to approach that.
Yes, I think there are some works, integrated fuzzing and concolic testing together.
Yep.
There are still open problems. I see in top tier security conferences, lots of works in fuzzing actually. So
Yeah.
the idea is, I mean, it just finds, undiscovered bugs, 0-day bugs. So I think which makes them kind of interesting.
Uh, Hey, sorry, I'm actually with two devices because one of them doesn't have audio, so I apologize. I was misleading to ask you to unmute me on the other one. So a couple of comments here. The first one is that Solarwinds was not so much an SBOM failure as it is an architecture failure. Because why would you give full permission to everything for software that needs to read some counters? There are far better ways to do that. And this is where a lot of the problems are coming, because a lot of other security principles like minimum privilege or are just violated in terms of architecture. The reason I'm saying this is because I have observed a number of nation state introduced vulnerabilities, which are pure plausible deniability. What I mean is that we have a foreign agent working for a company inserting a particular piece of code that intentionally doesn't do a buffer overflow check. And then we see the same nation state do exploitation of this very bug using that particular buffer. So you can't catch this with SBOM, because for all intents and purposes, this code was meant to be there. So I think SBOM is really good, but we also need to pay attention to properly training people to not only develop software properly, but also to deploy it properly.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. That was my first question, is like, why do you have this management system that can talk to all your infrastructure, but can also call out to random, IP addresses, do DNS?
Yeah, I personally stopped using Solarwinds some 15 years ago. At the time was much more software, but I remember that I rewrote all the capability that I needed in under 2 weeks in Purdue, and I was like, why do I even need this thing? But anyway, the rest of my case. Just another note. Also, Kudenomicon, before they were acquired by but anyway, they had a piece of software that did exactly what you're trying to do. I remember about 6 years ago, they had a huge library of binary objects and functions. So you could even feed them an ISO. They would read the file system, extract the different components, and then dissect it. Basically, they would be looking for the function calls, and they would take those. They had smart hashing, and they would match functions to non-functions from particular versions of software. So I forgot the name of the product. They're currently owned by Synopsys. So you may look at that as well.
I think Black Duck, is that the one?
Yeah, sounds familiar, yeah.
Yeah, there's a few tools out there that can generate SBOMs this way. Yeah, anyway, so definitely commercial products available.
Yeah. Because I mean, let's face it, most companies are so thin on budget, they would not want to deploy additional screening of their software and their software build when they do that, when they release software.
Yeah,
just the reality.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentation.
All right. So we are.
Hey, Levi, I think we have some questions in the chat also. One question from Kevin is, do you expect Longclaw to be commercialized someday?
Yeah, we would really like to commercialize it. So we've actually been talking to our sponsor about that, and trying to understand if that's something we can do. So all the stuff that we built to do the SBOM generation right now is, our open source tools. So it shouldn't really be a problem to open source that. We just have to kind of get the sponsor buy-in before we can do that. Sorry, I didn't even see the chat. I was looking at the Q&A.
Yeah.
Anything else from there?
Yeah, another question from Paul. how is SBOM different from capabilities that GitHub has?
I guess I'm not sure what specific capabilities, but if you have the source code, it's generally pretty easy to produce the SBOM. Code linting. Oh, okay, so yeah, so that's kind of the separate area. So looking at source code for bugs and stuff. So yeah, SBOM doesn't really address that, but we do have some other tools in Longclaw that do kind of source code analysis, and so probably pretty similar to what's in GitHub. And there's a lot of tools, as I showed, that kind of fit in that space.
All right, I think we are out of time, and these are the all questions. Levi, thank you so much. It was nice to like listen all these interesting topics, and I hope that sometime when it's warmer, you visit Purdue, West Lafayette.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, would be very happy to host you here.
Okay, sounds good. Well,
All
thank you so
right.
much. Have a good
Thank
day,
you.
everyone.
Thanks, Levi. Take care.